First of all, I wanted to say that I hope you will donate to this cause. I made my donation today. I really knowing that all of the money is going directly to a good cause. And that's why I agreed to do this, because I think that's a great thing to do right now. So we're going to talk about the history of open source as it's Microsoft. This is the first time I've given this, written it for this occasion. So we'll see how we do with time. But here we can switch to the slides. Get going. So you've already heard the title of the talk. You know the story about the leopard, whether or not the leopard could change its spots. And boy, that's a good question. So first, I actually worked for Microsoft for 6 months in 1994. Only 6 because I left on ethical grounds. And this was during a time when Microsoft was kind of at the height of its dominance in the software market. And in particular, I didn't leave because they didn't like open source. I'm talking about open source yet at that point. And I'm not going to say much about why I left. I'm going to say that when people talked about 800-pound gorilla in the room at that point in the industry, they were talking about Microsoft. And Microsoft had a habit of kind of rating companies. They would come in, especially startups that didn't have a lot of lawyers working for them. They'd come in and learn everything about your technology, and then they'd either buy you or you'd find that they were putting a product out that did kind of what you did. And I thought that was thing. Here is how it started. This is a copy of the famous letter that Bill Gates sent to the Homebrew Computing Club. That was a club that was working on personal computing, which was kind of a new thing in Silicon Valley at the time. And Bill was a member. In 1996, he sent this note that set up the Microsoft business model. So the company Microsoft already existed. He references Paul Allen in this letter. He basically said, you guys are stealing all of our work. So from now on, we're not going to give away our source code anymore. We're only going to give away executables. And that turned out to be, you know, a very lucrative business model. 10 years later, 15 years later, they were at the absolute top of the game and were, you know, dominant. Bill was the richest man in the world. So it's pretty clear you can make a lot of money that way. By 1998, when we from open source, Microsoft was already our worst enemy. And the reason we knew that was because of a thing called the Halloween documents. That was a set of documents that was a conversation between senior officials inside of Soft talking about their concerns about the open source movement and the ways that it could hurt the business model, specifically about Linux, but more broadly, an idea of people sharing source code. The guy in the center is Raymond, and he famously made these documents public. They were to him, and he made them public, and got Microsoft to admit that they were genuine. They were real documents inside of Microsoft, and that set up the whole push and pull between the source community and Microsoft at that time. The poster on the left gives you an idea of the flavor of that discourse. And so for a long time, we had a prime enemy number one, and it was Microsoft. In 1998, Mozilla announced they were going to be open source their browser. The reason that happened was because Microsoft made the decision to distribute their browser, Internet Explorer, the first version of it, bundled with the operating system, which meant that all 98% of the world users of personal computers, because that was their install base, 98%, were going to get it for free. And that did the startup NETSCAPE out of their business model of charging for browser. And this was not an unusual behavior on Microsoft's part. This is exactly the kind of stuff they did at the time. So this became a turning point. It was the first time that a corporation had decided to try to get the public at large to help them maintain a code base. It's the first ever corporate open source project. Now, a lot of this presentation is faces that they're people who were either on the wrong side or the right side of history about how open source was going to do. Remember, in 2000, there was no guarantee that open source was going to win in the marketplace. In fact, Microsoft felt pretty strongly that it should not. This is Stephen Wally. He was acquired by Microsoft in 2000. He the first GPL code with a Microsoft brand on it, something called Interix. It only shipped once. He spent the several years trying to get Microsoft to move the battleship in a direction towards open source. If you're a really big company, you don't know how hard it is to change something that has been really deeply ingrained in your culture and your population. Anyway, he eventually gave up and left and found other things to do, but he has found his way back to Microsoft now. He's there now. More about that in a minute. This is another guy from Microsoft. This is Jim Alden. He was the vice president at the time in the software division, and he was not happy about open source. And I think that this quote of Jim's is really interesting because in his private life, Jim was a musician, kind of a guitar hero. And this is around the time that Napster was happening, and it was making the music business change radically. And I think artists were starting to feel intellectual property was being ripped off by all this free share things. And I think this quote reads into the Microsoft software business, the things he saw happening in the music business that were not making him happy. He was the first senior executive at Microsoft to say anything about open source, but it set the seeds of a lawsuit. The guy on the right there, that is Scott McNealy, much younger than now Scott McNealy, and the guy on the left, of course, is Bill Gates. And they are testifying. There was a lawsuit filed by Scott McNealy and Jim Clark of NETSCAPE to basically ask the question, is Microsoft an illegal monopolist? And they were using the Netscape problem as the main thrust of that lawsuit, but there were also references to pretty much the open source project that Sun had thought they might have in the future. It's a very exotic list. One of the things that was on that list was openoffice.org. Now, I became famous on the back of openoffice.org, which was the second big open source project that Sun released. There were a couple small ones that were very influential, but the first really big one was Teams, which was an IDE for Java. And the second one was this OpenOffice project. Now, OpenOffice was a piece of software that did the same thing as the Office suite. And in fact, they had file formats of Microsoft Office. And so you could save into Office and then, take it back into the OpenOffice format for working on it. And that file format was novel. So what we did, looking at the fact that Microsoft got 40% of its revenue from Office, we decided it might be cool to open source something that would compete with that, since we were suing them, see if we could also make them feel it in the public. And in order to drive adoption, Microsoft was only servicing 13 languages worldwide, which I think is still the case for most of their products. We made it really easy to localize OpenOffice, and we had 160 different language implementations within the first 2 years. We had 600 million downloads of this product, but the most important thing about it was we stamped the file formats, which were written out in XML and then sent to Oasis and later to ISO. And the reason we were doing that was to Microsoft's hand the idea of changing the file formats to force upgrades, because they used to basically spend money on the backs of their install base. Anyway, this was a project that Scott McNealy loved because he was already really picking on Microsoft, and there was already the big lawsuit. I was into it because it helped bridge the digital divide, but everybody gets their strokes one way or another, right? Okay, meanwhile, back at Microsoft, Dave STUTZ, a researcher, started talking about Project Rotor. Project Rotor became C#, and it was initially released, code and all, under a license that was called the shared license. So not an open source license, This was something that big companies were trying at the time. Sun itself was releasing Java under a shared source license called the Sun Community Source License. So big companies were easing into the of sharing software, and Microsoft wasn't alone. Dave Stutz left after 3 years because he felt like the bad will engendered by Microsoft insisting on the source licensing model was really causing a lot of problems. This is Miguel Laza, who works at Microsoft now, but he didn't used to. He is famously a Mexican free software advocate, and he was super interested in the work that Dave Stutz was doing and the elegance of what became C#, particularly the decorated parse tree and the CLR. He thought those were amazing things. And so he negotiated a little deal with Microsoft, a partial reimplementation in open source, but resist, and he ended up way past the boundaries that Microsoft gave him. And we used to really worry that Miguel was going to get in trouble someday. But I'm showing you that even back in 2000, there were open source developers that were really interested in the work that Microsoft was doing. All right, here's another Microsoft executive, Craig Mundie. He also made a statement in 2000 about not being happy with open source way, because these guys were getting, I'm told, bad advice from their analysts, but also they didn't think the game was up yet. They thought they had more time to continue to make the margins, and they didn't see why they should change anything because that had not concluded yet. So Craig Mundie agreed in 2001 with Michael Tiemann in a debate format at something called OSCON Business. And I was in the room for that talk. And I have to say, I think it was a draw. I think it was really clear in 2001 that Microsoft didn't see a reason to change, despite Michael's best efforts to try to understand and reflect a new change. And then a little bit later that year, here's Ballmer making an unfortunate statement. Microsoft, open source. In retrospect, anytime you bring in hyperbola, there's God for Nazis. There's got to be one for cancer too. But I do think that it was very threatening to the existing plan of record for how Microsoft ran. This is Jason Matisow, one more Microsoft guy. He worked for legal at the time. He's still at Microsoft doing open standards, I understand. And here's an interesting little story. So Jason Matisow didn't understand the social dynamics of open source. He chose to call me out at OSCON, right in the middle of the expo floor. So there are a few thousand people milling around this expo floor. And you understand that I had spoken at every single open source conference that O'Reilly had ever. So I'm very much on my home turf. I are selling T-shirts at that moment for the OSI because I was serving the OSI board. I had just switched from working for Sun to working for Microsoft. And Jason started yelling at me. He said, "Hey, Denise, when are you going to stop picking on Microsoft?" And everybody on the floor stopped to see what was going to happen. I said, "Really? You want to do this now? Here? Like this?" He said, "Yeah, why not?" I said, "Okay. What's your problem?" He said, "You pick on us." I said, I'm going to keep picking on you until you make your file formats open source." And he said, "Well, I don't think we're going to do that." And I said, "Well, then we're going to make you do it." And there was a standing ovation on the floor. So, the early efforts of Microsoft to communicate, trying to understand open source, were hampered by a certain of discourse. This is Bill Hilf, who was the next guy who was running the open source program off at Matisow. And that's the back of my head. I am debating Bill the same way that Michael Tiemann debated Craig Mundie a few years earlier for OSCON Business. And Bill is losing. And the reason Bill is losing is in between those two speeches, all of those senior executives said what they said. And it was pretty hard to tap dance around the undeniable fact that the senior leadership of Microsoft didn't love open source, or how hard Bill was trying to change that. Bill wasn't a bad guy. We actually liked him, and he ended up hiring some good people. And it was pretty clear that the hardline position was beginning often. There was starting to be products shipped to create interoperability between open tools that everyone's using outside of the Microsoft world and Microsoft Windows. We're seeing more and more of that at this point. Enter Sam RAMJI, who gets 2 pictures to memorialize this keynote that he did at OSCON. It was the last time that there was open Q&A from the OSCON floor. And that was stopped because somebody asked Sam a really tough question after he had turned in a pretty good note. And he didn't know what to do. He was really flummoxed. But the truth is, Sam RAMJI, who did this job almost 4 years, an awful lot changed. He ran the open source progress. They fixed the intellectual property rights for Apache POI. They figured out how to get Samba to work with Microsoft Windows, which is kind of an amazing thing. They shipped some more stuff under GPL. They were very visible. And he was the first really approachable guy sitting in the open source seat. He was one of us, or he made it pretty clear he could be. And we started helping him as much as we could. So now they're poised for change because Sam's been there. A lot of changes happened, but he's leaving now. So now what's going to happen, right? By the way, these guys serially left this chair because that's does things, but also it was a lot of stress being a guy trying to do open source at Microsoft, right? So I want to say at this point, although they were just about ready to get there, they were definitely still engaging in behaviors that we wouldn't call helpful to open. And one of the last one happened was the forced approval of the XML spec for Microsoft's file formats. So that project with OpenOffice eventually forced their hand, and they did open the file formats. They had to, because all the governments of the world were going to standardize on open document format, and that, going to fit the business plan. But they couldn't do it fair and square. They actually had to bribe a bunch of people to do that approval of that through ISO. And it was really unfortunate. It was very well documented, exhaustively documented, the extent to which they kind of skirted the rules. And I think it was the last time in the open source world, when you behave like that, we out you. And I think they weren't used to that. Now, here we are back at the people that were holding that office. This is GIANUGO RABELLINO, who is still at Microsoft. He had worked on Apache POI at Apache. He was an Apache. He got recruited in, and while Sam was still there, and when Sam left, he ended up owning the open source program. GIANUGO helped start a company that was going to hold all the open source IP for Microsoft, called Microsoft Open Technologies, I think. Standing company. This is something a lot of companies tried to save themselves from the danger of losing control over their intellectual property. It's kind of fallen out of fashion now because it pretty much screams, we're not ready. And so companies don't try to do this anymore. But GIANUGO did it, and at the time it seemed like an important step. He did a lot of other good stuff too, which we'll talk about in a minute. And you guys saw Scott HANSELMAN earlier. I saw him as well. At this point, Scott was already an employee of Microsoft. He had started doing dev relations kinds of speeches, and he had that great joke where he would show the on his, a slide with that picture, and he'd say that he worked for Microsoft. And then he said, I work on minor planets, and, by which he meant Portland. He got the honor of becoming one of the last chairs of OSCON in 2015. And that was a really big deal. The first time a Microsoft person was allowed to be a chair at that conference. Now, here's the real sea change. It didn't happen until Satya took the CEO job. And Timothy told us in 2000 that eventually Microsoft would figure out, and we would need to figure out how to be, gracious in victory. And Satya made it easy. He talked that basically said, I care what went before. This is what I believe. And it was a pretty compelling talk. But you have to understand that for a lot of us fighting Microsoft, we spent so many years doing it that it's taken us a while to warm to the idea that it actually changed. So one of the signs when Ross Garber went to Microsoft, joined. Ross was the president of the Apache Software Foundation when he was recruited to do tech evangelism for open source at Microsoft, and he's still there working on Azure. And I would say that, in my opinion, Azure is the closest in all of Microsoft's holdings to being a real open source friendly partner. Ross has done really good work, both for Apache and for Microsoft in this regard. Here's another guy, James Duncan Davidson, also Microsoft employee today. He works in dev relations now. He was acquired when Wonderlust was bought. And I thought he'd spend no time at Microsoft because he's an open source guy. This is the original Apache Tomcat you're looking at here. But he has been for 5 years now, almost 5. And he seems to really be enjoying himself. So I say that there's definitely been some change, because there's no way Duncan would stick around if that wasn't the case. Martin Woodward, who just left Microsoft after a long career, has gone to GitHub to work on their DevRel, but he did a lot of work from the trenches, pushing the idea of increased transparency. And I did a podcast with him a couple months ago where he talked about how his observation that Microsoft got comfortable with open source at the edge of the company in projects like Samba and Apache Poi, and even the work that's been done for Azure. But now they're looking back inside the company and saying, wow, maybe we could learn how to use those grids inside the company. So there may be a sea change happening inside of Microsoft to promote more collaborative development techniques. We call that inner source, and Martin is a really big proponent of that, as is GitHub. And then, of course, the pièce de résistance is the announcement that GitHub was going to become a Microsoft property. Now came to Microsoft in an acquisition when Zimmerman was bought, along with Miguel. And it was clear what Miguel was going to do. He was, work on C# some more. But for now, it wasn't so clear what he was going to do. But it turned out it was GitHub. And people started asking me immediately after that announcement what I thought. One of the main people that has tried to help teach Microsoft a new way from the outside. And I said that I know Nat, and I think that he's going to do a great job. I'm not worried at all, because he's one of us, and he's going to do things doing that. So I'm really pleased with the way that that's working out, and that Microsoft is leaving that alone. Here are 2 women, finally, some women in this discussion. They're relatively new employees. Stormy Peters left is Jen open source royalty, and now she's going to be all embarrassed that I said that. But when I started doing open source 21 years ago, Stormy was already there working for HP, and she worked in their OSPO, and I set up Sun's OSPO, and we were kind of the 2 for a long time that were doing that. Sarah Novotny just joined from Google to work in the same team as Stephen Wally, and she's also amazing. She's particularly good with community dynamics, and I think Microsoft learned a ton from listening to her. We're starting to see some hires in my gender, and I think that's really great. This slide is a bunch of people that my fact checkers wanted to be sure were mentioned, and I'm actually going to read their names. I know some of them, but not them. So in the upper left-hand corner, you've got Ray Ozzie, who was the CTO in training for a long time. He gave a ton of air cover to the idea of open source finding a home at Microsoft. The guy next to him is Thomas Fennig, who is an architect that worked really hard on accurate documentation and Samba interoperability. The guy next to him is John Gossman, who is still at Microsoft and happens to be boss of the Stephen Wally, Sarah Novotny group. He's really the guy that has been driving the open source at Azure through Docker, Canonical, the Red Hat version of Linux, all things, and finding partnership opportunities. So he's kind of a secret mole right side. Guy next to him is Gene Paoli, who I wanted to be sure and thank. Gene hired GIANUGO and also helped him hire GARDLER, and has always really wanted to see more because he's one of the people that worked on XML back in the day. The guy on the bottom left is Bill Sills, who was a GM for Windows, and he invested heavily in PHP and also led the first class citizenship of open source for Azure. So yay you. Horatio Guterres, who's the next guy, is an IP lawyer who made all of the legal underpinnings shift so that Microsoft engineers start actually contributing upstream, which was, I'm sure, a lot of work. because I did that work at Sun and it wasn't easy. And then the last two guys, Jim Hugan and then John Lamb, they both did iron versions of famous open source languages. Fun and John did Iron Ruby. They both got involved in doing those projects because they wanted to show that the CLR was all hype. Both fell in love with it, just like Miguel did. So there you go. Thank all these gentlemen the next time you see one of them. So coming to the end, is Microsoft, super tidy in the open source world, and is it time to lay down our weapons? Well, I have to say that I think they've done some really good work. There's some definitely good, strong indications that we're heading in the right direction. But I'd say that it's also still a leopard. Once a leopard, always a leopard. And I'm not picking on Microsoft here. As open source advocates, it is our job to stay on the watch and watch companies that are claiming to be friendly to open source and hold them accountable if we find that that's not true. That's been true since day one in open source, and it's going to continue. So you think we're ready to let Microsoft be our friend, as to let us be tough love with them too. And on that basis, I'd like to say thank you for your time. I'm going to use up my time, so I don't think there'll be time for questions. But if you want to send me questions to either of those forums, either Twitter or to my, I'm happy to answer them. And that URL is where you find the podcast that I mentioned with Martin. And there's some other podcasts there about using open source methods inside your company, which is what I mainly work on now. So thanks for the opportunity to write a new talk. And I hope you guys really enjoyed the long rest of this event, and everybody donate. Thank you and goodbye.